Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. In this episode, I'm joined by Liam Zari, a fourth-year PhD student at Cornell University, and Dr. Eric Palkovacs, who's a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And they were here to talk about their recently published BioScience article, The Evolutionary Consequences of Dams and Other Barriers for Riverine Fishes. It was a great conversation, and so with no further ado, let's go straight to it. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So today we're going to be talking about dams and the evolutionary consequences for the fishes that live in their midst. So I was hoping you could just tell me a little bit about how this article came about. What kind of questions you were looking to answer with it.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the review really started when Eric and I were sitting in his office when I was doing my master's at UC Santa Cruz. We were working on a project related to water flows and interactions, how water flows and temperatures impact salmon and sturgeon in the Sacramento River. And Eric primarily studies evolutionary dynamics and rapid evolution. And we sort of started just kicking around ideas about looking at the evolutionary impact of dams. By a strange coincidence, when I started my PhD at Cornell University, my PhD advisor, Alex, actually recommended the same thing. So it seemed like a very natural direction. And so, yeah, we've been working on it now, I think 3 years.
And I've been working on dam evolution for since I did my own PhD, which is I started that about 20 years ago now, and thinking about how dams have caused the evolution of freshwater resident populations of alewife in Connecticut. So I've been working on that study system for about 20 years.
Okay, and so I think most of our listeners will have at least an updated post-pandemic understanding of the fact that evolution can happen at time rates that are faster than geologic. But what kind of evolutionary effects do you see from a dam? How long does it take?
Yeah, so I think in our review, which we looked at over 300 studies, we looked at both natural barriers. So that's going to be these incredibly long geological timescales, as you mentioned. But in terms of the dams, it's usually no more than a few hundred years. Some of the oldest dams are these mill dams in Europe or other parts of the world.
Okay, so, and you actually begin to see effects on the way that the fish look, behave in that time frame.
Yeah, exactly. So we looked at genetic diversity was a large component of the review, but we also looked at, as you mentioned, sort of trait changes. So migration, behavior, morphology, all of those. There's studies showing that they can all evolve following impoundment.
Okay, and I should probably back us up a little bit. Can we talk about what kinds of dams we're talking about here? I think when I think of a dam, I think of an enormous hydroelectric dam. I think of the Hoover Dam, but oftentimes we're talking about considerably smaller structures than that. What kinds of impoundments were most frequent that you looked at?
Yeah, I think something that has been known, I think, in the dams literature for a while. Most of the studies on dams, whether it's the ecological effects or the evolutionary effects, most of the studies are on these massive projects, the Hoover Dam, or massive hydroelectric projects. That being said, although those do cause very, very large ecological and evolutionary changes, by far and away the most common dams are these very small dams, the mill dams that we mentioned, small water diversions, or even culverts. So anytime a road and a stream meet, they have to get by each other somehow. And so usually a culvert is introduced. And Eric, one of the studies that we look at was this study that Eric worked on, brook trout culverts, and how that causes some really interesting changes.
Right, and the fact that there are so many culverts out there, and very few studies on their effects, suggests that really there's a lot of room to learn more about the effects of these small dams and culverts, especially.
So let's talk a little bit about culverts then, just since we're on the topic. What kinds of effects? How do they alter the way that fish are able to move across the landscape?
There's really two types of effects. One is the fragmentation effect, right? So they prevent fish mostly from moving from downstream to upstream. and then that fragments populations. It isolates upstream populations from downstream populations. That tends to reduce genetic variation. It can reduce trait variation in those populations. The other is it is a selective force, right? It's a source of human-driven selection, because fish that can pass culverts are a non-random subset of the total fish in the population. They tend to have certain traits, and then the culverts therefore select for those traits. So those traits include certain body shapes that allow them to swim more effectively and pass the culvert, as well as behavioral traits that sort of give them the motivation to want to pass culverts, whereas other fish simply don't have the motivation or the body shape to be able to overcome culverts. And then they end up basically being sort of isolated below these culverts, whereas these more mobile fish can move up above the culverts.
Just briefly to build on that, not only do the culverts really show this this impact of potential phenotypic change, but also usually the resident fish populations that are much higher up in the watershed, resident fishes, so they're not migratory, they're not moving around very much, typically higher in the watershed, there's less habitat, so there's a smaller population size, which leads to lower genetic diversity in the population. And so if you're heavily fragmenting already low genetic diversity population, this can cause high rates of inbreeding, which can actually lead to some really extirpation or local extinction of those populations. So, this is an area that we think probably warrants some more investigation.
What's the scale that you're seeing the loss of genetic diversity or really any other change on an evolutionary level in these populations? Is it dramatic, or are we looking at something that we detect primarily through genomic sequencing or something?
Yeah, I mean the way really to get at this is sequencing. Most of the studies that we found, there's a few different methods. The most common method that we found is using a technique which has been around for decades. It's looking at markers called microsatellites, and sort of the main takeaways are taller barriers, or ones that are less passable, are going to cause more fragmentation, lead to greater loss of genetic diversity. If there's less habitat in between barriers, that will lead to more rapid loss of genetic diversity. There's sort of a number of different factors that are really going to impact how quickly these populations decline in genetic diversity.
But that being said, I think there are many cases where you don't need to do any sequencing to see the evolutionary effect of these dams. And one case is where we have the formation of freshwater resident populations from a formerly migratory ancestor, right? We put a dam in a watershed that then isolates the migratory component of that population from the upstream freshwater resident component. We see the evolution of a whole new life history form, usually much smaller in body size. They don't migrate, right? They stay put where they are. They reproduce in those oftentimes in the reservoir. So we do have some more conspicuous examples that don't require any specialized DNA sequencing to detect the change.
Okay, so in that case, are we talking about species like, say, landlocked salmon?
Exactly, like landlocked alewife, freshwater resident form of steelhead trout is rainbow trout, right? And so those are often isolated above barriers when people put barriers into watersheds.
Okay, and since we're talking about barriers and what happens when we have those types of landlocked populations, I'm wondering what happens if the dam or other barrier is removed. And we've talked about that on past shows as well, but we've never talked about it from the genetic angle. What happens?
Yeah, I think it really looks like the jury is still out on that one. I mean, it's highly system specific in terms of mitigating the loss of genetic diversity. By far and away, it appears that removing the barrier is going to be more effective than installing a fishway, for example, because fishway or fish ladders can still be very selective in terms of the body size or the types of individuals which are passing them. But Eric is looking at that with secondary contact of alewife.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think it depends on is how divergent the above barrier population has become relative to the below barrier population. So in cases where we have a lot of trait differentiation between the above barrier and the below barrier population, we may even see some partial reproductive isolation between those populations. So one would think that normally you bring these populations back together by removing the barrier, and they merge right seamlessly into one population like they were before. But if trait change has proceeded for hundreds of years in separate evolutionary trajectories, what we're seeing is that there can evolve partial reproductive isolation due to things like differences in the timing of when the populations spawn. And therefore, we may not see immediate fusion back into a single population. We actually see some reproductive isolation. So we're not entirely sure how this process is going to proceed over decades, but right now it looks like at least in alewife populations in Connecticut that are sort of brought back together due to fishway construction, we do see some at least partial reproductive isolation between those populations.
And I think it also depends a lot on the species traits as well. So both when a dam is installed or a dam is removed, if the species is already, it's a resident species, it's not moving around very much like, some small darter species, small minnows, something like that. Even if you install a dam, you might not see any loss of genetic diversity because the fish are only moving, they're living out their whole life cycle in 100-meter reach of stream. If the dam is removed, then you might not really see much change either, which is, stands totally contrary to these highly migratory species, the salmon, the lamprey, the alewife.
Yeah, I'm wondering, how does this affect sort of the set of species that are in a given area? Obviously you have if you have selection pressures on which individuals of a given species are capable of navigating a culvert or fishway. I'm assuming that you have even greater divergence between which species can navigate those types of barriers. So do you end up with assemblages that are completely different in different areas of the same stretch of waterway?
Yeah, I think that one of the major consequences of the formation of reservoirs is sort of this change in habitat that changes the fish community entirely, right? From fish that live in sort of an open river type habitat to fish that are more adapted to like a pond-like or a lake-like environment. And so that change in the fish community is also a source of selection on the fish that live there, right? So oftentimes we have the invasion of predators that wouldn't normally exist in a river that can invade, say, in a more reservoir type environment. And so that can itself, that those community level changes can themselves produce some of these evolutionary changes that we're talking about.
So would that be a case like if you had the introduction of, say, a really capable, invasive predator species, likely prey species would then have a significant pressure to become quicker and more evasive?
Yeah. So one interesting example of that is in the morphology literature, which is, by a large margin, most of the papers we found on phenotypic adaptation in barriers focused on morphology. And it seems like many different species show dramatic morphological shifts, such as deeper body size, wider fin bases, which are all adaptations to navigating these slack waters as opposed to a more streamlined shape that allow fish to navigate flowing waters. And also the deeper bodies and the wider fin bases will help in predator avoidance. There are a few studies that documented larger spots on the fins, which distract predators. That type of thing.
Okay, and now I'm going to ask a question that comes with, an implicit plea for forgiveness because it's, of course, a completely unfair question. But is this bad? Is this type of evolution something that's primarily, of novelty to us, or is it something that, is going to make conservation even harder down the road? Is it something we should be, terribly worried about, or something that we should, mainly just be studying and kind of learning more about because it's of scientific interest?
Is it bad? It depends on what the goals are, as in anything. In terms of what evolution allows for is oftentimes persistence of populations that would not otherwise be able to persist in the absence of evolution. So, in that sense, evolution is always helpful, right, in terms of increasing fitness and allowing populations to adapt to new circumstances and therefore persist in altered environments. In that sense, it's quite helpful. In the sense of should we remove barriers because they impair the functionality of intact watersheds? I think the answer there is whenever possible, yes, because there's a lot of consequences of barriers for ecological interactions as well as evolutionary processes. And I think that, there's many ways in which barrier removals are helpful for a whole suite of reasons. But the evolution itself may allow these populations to persist long enough in an impounded watershed in order for us to get our act together and eventually remove those barriers.
It seems to be becoming more and more clear that a lot of these barriers, they're going to be coming down one way or another because people have, especially up here in the Northeast, people have forgotten about them. They've just disappeared into the woods and they've filled in with sediment. They're starting to fall down. They present a hazard to communities downstream. And if there are, also fragmenting fish populations, and that's impacting, forage for commercially or recreationally important species, or it's impacting biodiversity in the area, it seems like a pretty clear yes to removing many barriers. There's definitely some that are fulfilling a really important purpose that should stay up, but it's very, very case specific.
Yeah, is there a better culvert that can be built? The ones that I'm envisioning in my mind are, a round, aluminum tube with a road going over it or something like that. Is there a way to do that so that they, have less of an effect on, which species are able to and which individuals are able to bypass them?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of work going on now in how to design better culverts and better fishways to try to be less selective and try to present less of a barrier to fish. One of the things for culverts, the real bad culprit, right, are overhanging culverts, because fish cannot get up into a tube that's overhanging the stream below. And so culverts that are a continuous a path under a road, but without that overhang, are much less of a barrier to fish than those sort of old style overhanging culverts, which are really the major problem when it comes to fish passage.
And it also seems like a lot of the culverts that are bad for fish are also just bad culverts in general, especially with climate change and increasing sporadic flows. A lot of the culverts that are restricting flows, which impacts the fish that are trying to move up them, are also a lot more likely to get blown out during a big rainstorm. And so moving towards like a bridge, a small bridge or something like that just gives a lot more area for the river to flow, also, hopefully decreases the amount of work that whoever's maintaining the road will have to do.
Yeah, you've anticipated my next question, which was the climate change question. How do we expect, the obviously changing things that we're observing now to change even more rapidly or more, significantly, in the face of a climate that's, hitting us with more severe storms or, drought conditions, et cetera?
Well, in the West, reservoir capacity is becoming a big issue, right? And so reservoir capacity means that in California anyway, we're probably not going to be taking out many of these large dams anytime soon because the reservoir capacity is needed for water supply. And so it really does mean that we should be doing more research on how to make our fish passages less selective, right? So that they are more so they mimic more the natural selective regime that you'd find in a free-flowing river. And so the situation here where drought is a big concern is quite different. And I'll let Liam speak to the situation maybe in the eastern US where increased precipitation may be the major concern.
Yeah, all I guess I can say about that is that I know that something is happening. I've spent probably too much time on YouTube looking for epic culvert blowout. But yeah, definitely, culverts that are going to allow more water to pass just kind of give us more options in the future.
So you get better flexibility. So when you have those sort of, rare or previously rare events, it doesn't, wash out the entire road and culvert. And
right.
Okay. So one thing I'm wondering now, how well studied is this issue in other areas of the world? I gather from the article that most of your the articles that you were able to draw on are studying North America, and was Europe also well represented?
Yeah, Europe was pretty well represented, mostly Europe and North America. There's definitely a major latitudinal bias, as you mentioned, looking across. So in other parts of the world, the number of dams is actually increasing, which in North America and in Europe, there aren't that many new dams or hardly any new dams being built. But in other areas which are trying to generate electrical power, like the Amazon, for example, there's many, many dams going in, especially in the last decade. So as these regions are also vastly understudied in terms of their biodiversity, they're also understudied in terms of the evolutionary impact of dams.
Right. And so I want a last question then. What's next for your research? What kinds of things are you working on now, if you're able to talk about it? And what future directions would you like to see, for this type of work as well?
Yeah. So this project has actually inspired me to look more at removing the impact of removing barriers, and whether we see genetic diversity, whether we see a restoration of genetic diversity, or whether these impounded levels of genetic diversity sort of persist into the future. And so we're looking at the Hudson River watershed. Currently, there's a few dams that are removed every year, these small mill dams. And so I'm looking at a species of centrarchid called the red-breast sunfish, and looking across a few watersheds in the Hudson, including a few places where dams have been removed, to try and understand whether we see a pretty rapid recovery of genetic diversity or whether this takes a while.
Yeah, and in the alewife system that I've been working on for about 20 years, we're also looking at how these populations evolve in secondary contact, where we have fishways that now have been placed on dams. So we have anadromous alewife now spawning once again, for the first time in hundreds of years in lakes where we have had the evolution of these landlocked populations. And so we're tracking what's going to happen through time as those two sets of populations come back together.
Okay, great. Well, those both sound incredibly interesting, and we'll look forward to hearing more soon. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.